Hi everyone. Listen, I'm sorry I'm not there today, but I wanted to at least record kind of a short little lesson just to kind of summarize what we talked about yesterday and building on last week's reading of all the texts, looking at the symbols, the ideas, the writers, why they're writing, who they're writing for, and how we go about approaching the question and planning our essay. So the first thing we did is obviously we picked a question. We looked at again, the key words in a question, what they mean, what we're actually writing about. So this was one of the three kind of sample questions we gave you. Analyze how symbols are used in the text to comment on society. So we have to identify really first of all, what it is that the actual essay is going to be about. When I say what it's going to be about, I don't mean what we're going to use to explain something, but what's the overall message? What are we trying to get across? What is the writer trying to get across? What do we read and take away from the story? And generally, most of the time you're going to find that towards the end of a level 2 question. So for instance, this essay is about the comment on society. What is this text trying to tell us about society? Now, how are we actually going to show people that? How are we going to show them that this text is about this particular comment on society? Well, we're going to use the symbols in the text. And what we're going to do is we're going to analyze them. We are essentially going to break them down one by one to show how each symbol basically presents a comment on society. So before we start planning and writing, we have to realize that what this essay really is a paper on a particular comment on society. And that we're going to prove this comment on society by breaking down, which is again analyzing, how each symbol supports this comment. So logically, we actually have to start by looking at what we think the comment on society is. Now, I'll use the text, The Red Bow, by George Saunders, as the example in this exemplar. So before I go back into the symbol and to the guides, I have to ask myself, what is it that George Saunders is actually trying to tell us about society in his story, The Red Bow? And if you read through the additional readings, if you do some online research, if you just immerse yourself with asking questions about what it was like to live in America in 2008, 2009 when the story came out, what had happened prior to the story coming out, we can probably start to deduce and come up with a couple of guesses as to what it might have been like to live at that time, as well as what George Saunders is trying to tell us to do. Now, I certainly don't expect you to have this kind of just out of nowhere pop into your head, but after you've done some reading, you should have some idea, and looking back on the readings and the themes in the study guide, what generally these texts are trying to do. And, we could say and argue that, if you read George Saunders' The Red Bow, it's about fear and paranoia. And then these people are fearful of more rabid dogs attacking their children and potentially leading to more deaths. And people like Uncle Matt are using this fear and that paranoia to basically manipulate and persuade other people. Not because they necessarily want to prevent what's going to happen again, but they want to achieve their own goals, their own desires. There's something within themselves that doesn't feel right or complete, and they're using this power to fill that void. Now, that's a pretty kind of deep, heavy comment on society, but one that you could probably support just by looking at some of the symbols in the text. So let's go ahead and kind of brainstorm what some of these symbols could be. Symbol number 1, I think, is the bow. Now, the bow used in the text is not actually Emily's bow. So Uncle Matt uses another bow to manipulate and guilt other individuals to agree to his demands. So even though the title is called The Red Bow, and it alludes to the fact that Emily's dead body is being brought in by her father, and she's got this pretty red bow that we sometimes associate with childhood and innocence in her, Uncle Matt takes a different bow. Not one that obviously belonged to Emily, belonged to her sister, and he carries it around and shows it to people because he wants them to feel bad. He wants them to feel guilty. He wants to instill that emotion, that fear into them, so that they won't disagree or argue when he asks to put down their animals. So he doesn't have that by coincidence. He's carrying that around for that particular purpose. And that's one strong symbol that can be used to show how we use emotion. And fear is one of the primal emotions to convince other people to do things. And now our second symbol here could be as simple as the rabid dogs. Even though they are characters, I suppose, that are alluded to in the text, these rabid dogs are also symbolic. I mean, when you think of a rabid dog, you're talking about a wild animal. And a wild animal that's lost all control is incredibly dangerous, as we've seen by the fact that these dogs kill Emily. So rabid dogs are wild animals who act on primal instinct, and can easily become violent and dangerous. Now, again, if you think about these rabid dogs, I mean, they inspire fear, don't they? I mean, you kind of fear for your life if you're with a wild animal that really knows no kind of rules or boundaries. And the rabid dogs are almost a symbol for Matt himself. You know, he's lost all control. He's acting on these primal instincts of power, and he's using that to manipulate other people through fear. And if we were looking for a possible third symbol, that could also talk about how we respond and how we are persuaded to do things when under fear or paranoia, you can simply look at the guns used in the story as well. I mean, these are carried around by Uncle Matt as he prepares to kill the dogs. I mean, you know, guns can be seen as protection, but also as a weapon and a threat. I mean, if someone's approaching you with a gun and they're in an emotional state where they're grieving, they're sad, they're not rational, they may use that as a threatening piece of a threatening instrument to try to get you to believe something or do something. And so each of these symbols, the bow, the dogs, the guns, all show how, you know, if we put someone in a position of fear, then it's very easy to manipulate and persuade them, especially if we can, again, play on that emotion. And what we have here, at least initially, is a starting point. It's a plan. This is what we wanted to have covered during yesterday's lesson. And once we kind of have this idea, we need to add a couple more things to our plan before we start writing. Because if we want those merits and excellences, we have to be able to look at what the author's purpose is, and we have to be able to provide some insight and perspective to create a perceptive response. Now, sometimes the author's intended message or purpose isn't going to be obvious. It's not going to be you punch it into a Google search engine, it's the first thing that comes back. It's going to require a little bit of research and some skimming over a variety of different websites, reputable ones, and trying to get an idea of how you can prove this. And I punched in George Saunders' Red Bow message purpose into a Google search engine, and it didn't yield too much. But as I try to refine it a little bit by talking about allegories or using those keywords of fear and paranoia that came out of my comment on society, I could find things a bit more specific. Now, this article here about George Saunders talks a little bit about his history and who he is as a person. But as I skimmed through the article, I could take a look and realize a couple things. One, the Red Bow was actually part of a collection of short stories called Impersuasion Nation. And if I look at the themes that I was talking about, is that the fear and paranoia are used to manipulate and persuade. Well, the fact that this story falls in a collection called Impersuasion Nation, that's a good hint that I'm on the right track. And as I scroll down further and kind of skim through and try to figure out what I can use, what I leave behind, I'm hoping I'm going to find something a little bit more specific. Sometimes I will, sometimes I won't. But you will see certain things start to emerge. And here we go. Now, I could use this. I could fit this back into what its purpose is. Here it says the Red Bow is an allegory for the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. So after a wild pack of dogs kills a young girl, her father, technically her uncle, yielding his dead daughter's little red bow, or what looks like her red bow, lobbies fellow citizens to preemptively eliminate all the pets in town to prevent further attacks. They go back through the famous line by the grieving mother, kill every mouse, kill every bird, kill every fish, anyone who objects, kill them too. Well, hang on, now this is great. This is something I can potentially use now. I can go back to my notes. So what is George Saunders' purpose for writing the text? To send a message to the American public that they have been manipulated by their government based on the fear and grief they are suffering to attack other countries and individuals to achieve their desires through governments. You may not understand a lot of the context originally. No one is expecting you to. But once you start looking into it a little bit further, you'll now realize that, or you might realize that, the American nation went to war on terrorism, attacked Iraq and overthrew its government, killed and displaced millions of people, based on the assumption that this country had weapons of mass destruction and they were harboring terrorists that contributed to the 9/11 bombing. All of these things actually happened. We continue to see the effects of it in the real world. The United States government running, over 70 counter-terrorism missions across the world and in different countries where, would that have happened had those bombings not occurred? Would that have happened if the government didn't instill this fear and paranoia to convince its people that it needed to wage war on terrorism? This little short story is trying to get the American public to realize that it's been taken advantage of. And as a result, not only has done nothing to alleviate the fear and paranoia, but it's potentially made it worse. So what insights can we gain from all of this? Now that we've done a little bit of reading, we've done a little bit of research, what is it that we've potentially picked up that might kind of help us spin this essay into something a lot more meaningful? Well, perhaps the idea that you can't eliminate fear and paranoia with more fear and paranoia. You can't get rid of this fear and this grieving by telling them that they're constantly under attack. And that's what's happened, and that's what's perpetuated this for so long. Other insights is that the best way to manipulate people is to manufacture a feeling of fear. And I mean, we can go back in human history and see that this is the case, whether it be through the First, Second World War, or all the armed conflicts of the 20th century. People have been led to believe that threats were greater than they were to justify mass military missions. Another potential insight here is that you look at the story even and you think, Ed the father, would he have gone through all this trouble if Uncle Matt wasn't egging him on, if Uncle Matt wasn't creating this organization? Is that, people develop a mob mentality when surrounded by others and their feelings of fear and rage, whereas individuals come to their senses a bit quicker. So it's about irrational versus rational behavior. And individually, without others, or without this mob mentality, we're able to kind of rationalize what's acceptable, what's not, what's dangerous, what's not. But in mass amounts of people, large groups, we lose this kind of reason. We lose this rational behavior. We're much more willing to give in to these primal instincts and fears, just like the dogs. It's not one dog, it's a pack of dogs. Just like a pack of people are much more dangerous than a single individual. Now that we've got our plan done, and we've looked at, the author's purpose, the insights, and how we might break this down using the symbols, now we just need to start drafting. Now, obviously, the most obvious place to start with our drafting is the introduction. We have to understand what the purpose of an introduction is, right? It's not only to introduce the text, it's also to ensure that we answer the essay question. So as long as we've done these two things, then we should have an introduction that is going to meet kind of the standard of what we want to explain to the reader and the examiner of the essay. So we might just start by a simple statement that introduces the text. So The Red Bow, 2009, by George Saunders, is a short story and that examines the grief and response of one family who tragically lose their daughter in a dog attack. So I've gone ahead there and I've introduced the text right off the bat. It's nothing too flashy. I don't want to get into a plot summary. I don't want to basically retell the reader what the story is about. I just want to give them a little bit of context first. At this stage now, I just want to go immediately into answering the question, right? Which is analyze how symbols are used to comment on society. So, in his short story, George Saunders' comment on society is that, and this is where sometimes you just go right back to your notes. What was that you wanted to say? And in this case, the common society is that fear and paranoia are used by individuals and governments to manipulate and persuade us to act in a way that achieves their goals. Okay, now it's not word for word what I have planned, but it gets the idea across. Okay, now I've talked about what the common on society is. Now I need to state that we're going to analyze how three symbols demonstrate this common society. So this can be demonstrated by analyzing how symbols are used to support this comment. Right. The symbols include the red bow, the rabid dogs, and guns. Okay, now I could end my introduction right here. I've gone ahead, I've introduced the text, and I've answered the essay question. Okay, I've tried to use keywords from the question, and you can see that there's really no one right way to structure it, so long as you do both of those things. And so that the reader knows that I'm talking about the red bow, the common society is about fear and paranoia, and then I'm going to demonstrate that using the following symbols. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to construct that introduction based on the information in the notes you have.